You spend your whole life saying yes to the people you love. You give in, step back, swallow your pride, erase yourself, all in the name of peace. In the name of family. In the name of so-called unconditional love. But what happens when that love turns into currency? When the very person you protected the most becomes the one who cuts the deepest wound? This story isn't just about a mother. It's about a woman. A woman who, for decades, was the pillar of a crumbling household. Who endured betrayal, rejection, humiliation, and yet still set dinner on the table. A woman who, like so many others, was taught to endure everything except the abandonment of her own children. But even the most generous soul has a breaking point. What would you do if your own daughter sent you an email saying, "Better watch my wedding online"? LOL. It sounds like a cruel joke, but that's exactly how Eleanor discovered she was being excluded from the most important day of her daughter's life. And not by mistake. By decision. But there are no fairy tales here. No easy forgiveness. What there is courage. Rupture. A mother who was tired of being a hostage to manipulation and emotional blackmail. Who finally understood that respect is not begged for, it's demanded. And who, for the very first time, decided to choose herself. The price of that choice? Costly. Family scandal, exclusion, attacks on social media, but also something money could never buy: freedom. Self-recognition. And the beginning of a new life she never imagined was possible. This story is more than just a plot twist. It's a mirror. A call to every woman who has ever felt devalued inside her own family. And maybe by the end, you'll realize you didn't really lose anyone. You simply found yourself again. If you've lived something similar, this story will stir something deep inside you. And if you haven't, it will help you understand why so many women bury their pain in silence. So stay with me until the very end, and if stories like this speak to your heart, make sure to subscribe and ring the bell. Because there's a lot more truth coming your way. It all began with a single click. Eleanor had no idea what she was about to read when she opened an email with the dry subject line about the wedding. It was from her daughter. She expected a formal invitation, maybe a request for help with preparations, a tender gesture. What she got instead was a bucket of ice water. "I think it's better if you just watch online." LOL. That wasn't just rejection. It was a sentence. A mother being erased from the altar where she had always dreamed of seeing her daughter shine. The coldness of those words pierced her chest like a fine blade. No shouting, no scandal, just pure, calculated contempt, disguised behind a mocking laugh. For years, Eleanor had endured in silence. She had been the sacrificial mother, giving up her own needs to cover her children's whims. Working double shifts to maintain the lifestyle they demanded. All in the name of what she thought was unconditional love. But that email made it brutally clear Natalie didn't see any value in that anymore. Worse, she seemed proud of shutting her mother out. The scandal wasn't public, but inside, Eleanor's world collapsed. How could someone who had been given so much treat her with such indifference? She reread the email 10 times. Searching for some explanation, some hidden phrase that could soften the blow. But there was none. It was raw, direct, cruel. It wasn't a mistake, it wasn't miscommunication. It was control, manipulation. Natalie didn't just want her mother absent, she wanted her to feel small, disposable, forgotten. By erasing Eleanor from the wedding, she was erasing the sleepless nights, the silent sacrifices, the endless devotion that motherhood had demanded. Eleanor thought of everything she had done for that daughter. The birthdays she paid for alone, the nights she stayed awake when Natalie was sick, the humiliations she endured to keep peace in the family. This wasn't just a denied invitation, it was a mirror reflecting the ingratitude she had been refusing to see. And that kind of betrayal, silent, sharp, deliberate, cuts deeper than any scream. The pain blended with shame. How could she explain this to her friends? How could she justify her absence at her own daughter's wedding? And worst of all, how could she avoid being painted as the villain? Because in the end, society always blames the mother. They expect her to understand, to forgive, to swallow it one more time. But at that moment, Eleanor had no strength left to smile. The humiliation of being cut from such a sacred day was too heavy to bear. She remembered a phrase she had once heard: some children only love as long as they're receiving. It was harsh to accept, but maybe that was the case. Because love that demands exclusion, that imposes conditions, isn't love. It's a power game. And Natalie, with that icy email, had made it clear she wanted to play and win. But this time, it hurt differently. It wasn't rage. It wasn't rebellion. It was rupture. As if part of her had died in that moment and another part, stronger, had just awakened. For the first time, Eleanor felt that she shouldn't and maybe couldn't try to fix it. Sometimes, when pain arrives like that, what's left isn't apologizing for existing, but realizing there is life after exclusion. Even if that life has to be rebuilt from scratch. And it was there, in front of that screen, alone in the silence of her living room, that Eleanor understood this wasn't just an email. It was a turning point. A wake-up call. A test. And also an invitation not to a wedding, but to something far more profound: the beginning of her liberation. Because hidden behind that humiliation was an opportunity. The chance to finally start living for herself. What she would do from that moment on. Well, that was only the beginning. Her first instinct was to explode. To send a furious voice message, to write a long outraged text, to call her daughter ungrateful. But Eleanor took a deep breath. Not out of weakness, but out of strategy. Because after a lifetime of being controlled by other people's yelling, she finally understood that true power lies in choosing silence. Not the silence of fear, not the silence of submission, but the silence that unsettles. The silence that breaks the cycle of manipulation. The silence that leaves the other person lost, searching for the reaction they were counting on but never receive. Natalie was used to seeing her mother bend. To seeing her apologize even when she wasn't at fault. To seeing her beg for crumbs of affection. That email had been a calculated provocation, designed to spark exactly that drama: tears, desperation. But Eleanor didn't give her the show she was waiting for. Instead, she closed the laptop, made herself a cup of tea, and sat quietly. The kind of silence that teaches. That dismantles emotional games. That proves sometimes the loudest scream is saying nothing at all. And this kind of attitude requires courage. Because the pressure comes from everywhere. Society expects mothers to be endlessly forgiving. To endure everything, to accept exclusion with a smile. But Eleanor was starting to see that this image of the perfect mother was a trap. A cruel way of controlling women through guilt. And she had carried guilt long enough. Now it was time to protect herself, not with anger, but with boundaries. In the days that followed, the phone stayed silent. No call from her daughter. No explanation. Silence turned into a mirror, and for Natalie, perhaps it was more unbearable than any confrontation. Because when the mother doesn't react, manipulation loses its grip. The victim begins to stop being a victim. And the one who thought they held all the control starts to lose it. Eleanor realized she was finally turning the game around. No yelling. No endless justifications. Just the refusal to keep playing the same old role. It's strange how, when we fall silent, other people start to reveal themselves. Natalie, with no response, began posting pictures of the wedding in the family group chat, adding sarcastic captions. She tried to provoke, to create embarrassment. But Eleanor didn't budge. She didn't respond. Because she already understood anyone who needs to insult in public is just screaming for control. And anyone who is truly at peace has nothing to prove. Her absence of response was now her strongest presence. For years, she had believed that giving in was love. That staying quiet was maturity. But now she could see the difference between passivity and wisdom. Choosing silence in that moment was an act of resistance. An act of autonomy. Because what was at stake wasn't an invitation, it was respect. And without respect, no relationship can survive. Not even between mother and daughter. especially when love is twisted into a weapon of emotional blackmail. Silence also allowed Eleanor to finally hear herself. For the first time in years, she listened to her own pain, to the exhaustion built up over decades, to the times she had been invisible in her own home, to the dinners she ate alone, waiting for her children to arrive, to the effort of always being available and the loneliness of never being truly seen. She understood that what she felt wasn't weakness. It was depletion. It was the weight of a soul that had given too much for too long. And maybe it was finally time to rebuild herself. While the world expected her to explode, Eleanor chose the opposite. And that was more powerful than any confrontation. Because her silence carried meaning. It was the sound of rupture. The beginning of a new posture. And perhaps the biggest scandal to a family used to controlling through guilt. A woman who had finally stopped begging for love and started demanding respect. But Eleanor's silence wasn't only emotional, it was strategic. And with it came clarity. For years, she had financed her children without questioning. Donations disguised as help, gifts that looked more like emotional ransom. For Natalie's wedding alone, she had already spent $30,000. And another $50,000 was about to be transferred to cover the remaining costs. But now, with the explicit exclusion, that transfer no longer made any sense. This wasn't vengeance. This was emotional justice. This was recognizing herself as someone who had already given too much, someone who finally needed to stop. Canceling the transfer was a simple action at the bank, but monumental inside. For the first time, Eleanor prioritized her own dignity. She was no longer the giving mother, always available on demand. That version of Eleanor, the one who sacrificed everything for others, was fading into the past. She knew this choice would have consequences. That she would be judged, maybe even hated. But she couldn't keep financing her own humiliation. It made no sense to fund the luxury of an event where her worth as a mother didn't even earn her a seat in the audience. This was about much more than money. This was about autonomy. About drawing a clear line between love and submission. Because when affection becomes a financial obligation, something is broken. Eleanor realized her constant generosity had turned into currency for manipulation. She wasn't a mother anymore, she was an emotional ATM. And as painful as it was to admit, every deposit she made was also fueling the control her children held over her. Her decision wasn't announced with drama. She simply didn't send the money. And she waited. She knew silence would create noise. And it did. Messages began pouring in from the wedding planner, from the groom, even from distant relatives. All of them confused, trying to understand why she had pulled out. But none of them asked how she was. None of them thought about how devastating it was to be rejected by her own daughter. They just wanted the money. They just wanted the show to go on at the cost of the dignity of the one who was supposed to pay for it. Eleanor felt the full weight of being devalued. Not as a direct insult, but as a total absence of care. It was clear if she wasn't useful to the spectacle, she was disposable. And that, she realized, is what so many mothers face without even noticing. They are cherished only while they provide. But if they dare to set boundaries, they instantly become the villains. She understood then that money was never the real problem. The problem was how it had been used to feed a cycle of exclusion and control, disguised as family love. And in that moment, she saw something even deeper. Money had become the only bond between her and her children. It was painful to admit, but every conversation, every I love you, every invitation had been tied to some request, some financial urgency, some transfer. And that hurt more than absence because it proved she was being replaced. Not by another person, but by convenience. With the money withheld, Eleanor felt, for the first time, that she had control over something. That she could choose. That her existence wasn't reduced to the role of emotional financier. Yes, it was a shock. But it was also a relief. Because in that moment, a new identity was being born. The identity of a woman who still had plenty to give, but now with awareness, with limits, and most importantly with self-respect. That single financial no would become the spark for everything that came next. But Eleanor had no idea that what seemed like a simple, practical decision was actually symbolic a rupture with the role of the self-sacrificing mother. And for the first time, the choice was hers alone. Justin was the first to call. His voice was firm, almost harsh. "Mom, what are you doing?" Eleanor immediately recognized that tone. It was the same one he had used years ago whenever he disapproved of her choices, even without knowing the full story. But now, it sounded different. In the face of her new firmness, her son sounded nervous, impatient. "Are you really going to leave your sister hanging over some misunderstanding?" The question landed like a disguised slap. But deep down, Eleanor knew this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was contempt. And she would no longer pretend not to see it. For the very first time, she didn't try to explain herself. She didn't apologize. She didn't soften her words. She simply said, "Justin, I was excluded. I wasn't invited." There was silence on the other end. He tried to push back, but all that came out were accusations. "You are being selfish. This isn't the time to think about yourself." That sentence hit her like a weight of lead. How many times had she heard those exact words in her life? That taking care of herself was selfishness. That choosing herself was abandonment. Eleanor felt her blood boil. But she breathed. Because now she knew it was exactly that kind of pressure that had kept her trapped all these years. So she spoke. Softly but firmly. She laid out the sacrifices not in a bitter tone, but as truth finally spoken. The sleepless nights. The debts she carried alone. The birthdays she had spent by herself while her children lived their own lives. The absent father. The lack of support. The emotional loneliness. And then she said the words that marked the turning point. "You can call me selfish, Justin. But I have finally chosen not to abandon myself anymore." There was no immediate reply. Only silence. But this time, the silence wasn't hers, it was his. What hurt Eleanor most wasn't her son's criticism, it was realizing that after everything she had done, he still saw his mother as an obligation. As someone meant to always yield. As if a mother's love had no limits. That was part of the generational conflict. Justin had grown up seeing his mother as too strong to ever break. As if she had no feelings of her own. And now that she was setting boundaries, he saw it as betrayal. A cruel inversion where the victim is cast as the villain. But Eleanor knew she couldn't go back. Because going back would mean validating the entire cycle of devaluation. And that, she refused to do. "If you want to talk, I'm here," she told him. "But I won't finance your sister's wedding, and I won't pretend I wasn't rejected. This isn't about money. It's about respect." Justin hung up without saying goodbye. And that hurt. Because she loved her son. But she loved even more the woman she was rediscovering. And that woman could no longer survive on scraps. It was a hard day. Eleanor cried alone in the kitchen, staring at old photos. Justin in his school uniform. Natalie blowing out birthday candles. And herself always in the middle, always balancing everyone and everything. It felt like something inside her had cracked. But along with the pain came something new, a seed of courage. Because for the very first time, she wasn't just the mother. She was a person deciding her own worth. And that, despite everything, was liberating. The rupture with Justin wasn't final, but it was a landmark. An open wound that one day might heal, but for now, it served as a reminder love without respect is prison. Eleanor understood that rebuilding her life would require painful ruptures. And yes, choices have consequences. But choices also have power. And for the first time, she was choosing to truly live, even if that meant losing her children's approval for a while. There, between tears and memories, Eleanor felt it. This shock wasn't the end. It was the beginning. Because every truth, when it first comes to light, hurts. But after it hurts, it sets you free. And the truth was becoming clear: she had never been weak. She had only been trapped in a role that no longer fit her. It didn't take long. 3 days after her silence with Natalie and the rupture with Justin, the phone rang again. This time, it was Natalie. Her voice, once confident and distant, was now trembling. "Mom, we need to talk." Eleanor's heart raced. Part of her wanted to listen to her daughter, to hug her, to forget everything. But the other part, the newer, stronger part, remembered the cold email. The calculated exclusion. "Of course. Go ahead," she answered calmly. On the other end, Natalie didn't hide her panic. The wedding was collapsing. Vendors cancelling. Debts piling up. The glamorous dream was turning into a nightmare. Deep down, Eleanor knew this moment would come. Not because of revenge, but because life always makes us face the consequences of decisions made on the pain of others. Natalie now needed her mother, but not to celebrate love. She needed money. And perhaps, too, the emotional stability she had always drawn from her mother. "If you help me with the 50,000, I think I can convince Marcel to let you come," Natalie said bluntly. Eleanor closed her eyes. That wasn't reconciliation. That was negotiation. And her worth, once again, was being measured in numbers. "No, Natalie. It's too late." The words came out steady. Not with hatred, but with the weight of someone who had finally learned self-preservation. There was a long silence. "Are you punishing me, Mom?" her daughter asked. And then Eleanor gave the answer that would echo for a long time. "No. I'm protecting myself." That was the watershed moment. Natalie cried, begged, tried to twist the story with lines like "You're destroying my wedding," or "You always make everything about you." But Eleanor didn't break. Because now she saw it clearly, those who flip the blame are rarely ready to take responsibility. Natalie's panic wasn't only about money, it was emotional. For the first time, Eleanor wasn't available. And that shattered the entire dynamic. Natalie had always relied on the certainty that no matter what she did, her mother would always be there. It was a love tested to its breaking point. But now, the limit had been reached. Eleanor realized what she felt wasn't a lack of love, it was love for herself, finally emerging after years of self-abandonment. And for Natalie, that was new, unsettling, revolutionary. The call lasted almost an hour. Between emotional pleas and veiled accusations, Natalie revealed her desperation. But not once did she offer a sincere apology. Not once did she acknowledge the pain she had caused. What she expressed was only fear of losing the support she had always taken for granted. Eleanor, with her heart tight but her resolve unshaken, held her ground. "Natalie, I love you. But I love myself too. And I will no longer finance my own exclusion." Those words lingered in the air. It was the final line in a relationship built on control, and the first line in a new chapter for Eleanor. After hanging up, she cried. Of course she did. Because setting boundaries with those you love hurts. But not as much as continuing to disrespect yourself. The phone didn't ring again that day. No more attempts to convince her. No truce. Eleanor knew her daughter needed that shock. And maybe, for the first time, Natalie was being forced to grow up. Because when a mother stops being the crutch, children finally have to look at their own steps and realize just how unsteady they are. That night, Eleanor did something symbolic. She pulled out the folders where she had kept receipts, statements, IOUs, everything tied to family investments. And she threw them away. Not out of rage, but as a ritual of closure. Because she finally understood what bound her wasn't the money itself, but the emotional weight it carried. Those papers told the story of a woman who gave everything of herself. But now it was time to start writing a new story. And deep inside, even with a broken heart, she felt peace. Because every no she said was, in truth, a louder yes to herself. And it was only the beginning. 2 days after that final call, the doorbell rang. It was early, a grey Saturday morning. When Eleanor opened the door, she was startled. Marcel, Natalie's fiancé, stood there. Eyes down, shoulders heavy, shame written all over his face. "I need to talk to you." Alone, he said, almost in a whisper. Eleanor hesitated for a moment, but let him in. The young man looked deeply uncomfortable, nervous. He sat at the table like someone carrying a weight far too heavy. I wrote that email, he confessed, his voice breaking. But it was at Natalie's request and at my mother's insistence. Eleanor's stomach turned. The exclusion hadn't just been Natalie's cruelty. It had been orchestrated. Marcel explained everything. His mother, a traditional Frenchwoman, hadn't wanted Eleanor at the wedding. She cited cultural differences, but the real reason was control. Natalie, influenced and afraid to confront her, complied. She said you would ruin everything with your intensity. Eleanor inhaled deeply. She didn't know what hurt more, being portrayed as a problem, or knowing her daughter allowed it. The betrayal was doubled her daughter, and now her daughter's future in-laws. I didn't want to do it, but they insisted, Marcel said, visibly ashamed. Eleanor watched him carefully, trying to see if this was sincerity or just another manipulation. But he seemed genuine. He was there not knowing if he'd be forgiven, but feeling he needed to tell the truth. And then he said the line that changed everything. If it were only up to me, you would be there. But I was weak. And now the wedding is falling apart. Inside, Eleanor felt a mix of relief and fury. Relief at finally hearing the truth. Fury at realizing, once again, she had been the one sacrificed. She listened without interrupting. Because at that moment, she didn't need answers, she needed clarity. And the clarity was undeniable. Natalie hadn't just chosen to exclude her. She had chosen to please others instead of protecting her own mother. She was afraid to upset her mother-in-law, but she didn't think twice about hurting me, Eleanor said, her voice calm but heavy. Marcel lowered his head. She's in panic now. She keeps saying that without your help, nothing will work out. Eleanor just nodded. She already knew. What she didn't know was that the story was beginning to spread. Guests were asking questions about the absence of the bride's mother. The explanations didn't match. Eleanor's silence was starting to raise suspicion. Some people are already talking. And part of the family is on your side, Marcel admitted. That, Eleanor hadn't expected. For the first time, someone recognized that she might be right. That her absence wasn't a whim. It was an answer. A justified one. Marcel stood to leave, but before going he said, "I'm sorry. I know it doesn't change anything. But I needed to tell you." Eleanor walked him to the door. "You did what you thought was right in the moment. Wrong, yes, but human. Now the one who needs to make the right choice is Natalie." Her words weren't spoken in anger, but with the clarity of someone who had finally stopped being invisible. She closed the door slowly. No shouting. No drama. Only the silence of a woman who was tired of always being the one sacrificed. That day, Eleanor felt something shift deep inside her. Knowing the truth hurt, but it also brought a liberating clarity. Because, as cruel as it was, she finally realized she wasn't crazy, she wasn't exaggerating. She was simply seeing what had always been there. And that kind of recognition, even when it arrives late, is the beginning of a new strength. She knew the next move wasn't hers. It was theirs. But for the first time, she was no longer willing to pay the price to find out. Natalie's response didn't come in the form of an apology, it came as an attack. On Sunday afternoon, Eleanor received a Facebook notification. She opened it curious, not expecting what she would find. Her daughter had posted an old photo of the two of them with a long caption titled, "When a Mother Envies Her Own Daughter's Happiness." Reading it felt like being punched in the stomach. Natalie exposed twisted details, painting Eleanor as someone sabotaging the wedding out of jealousy, bitterness, and wounded pride. A family scandal turned into a public spectacle. In the comments, division appeared instantly. Some followers, friends, and relatives of the bride jumped on the narrative, "Stay strong, Natalie. Some mothers really are toxic. You deserve happiness, no matter the past." But something began to happen that Eleanor hadn't expected. Amid the judgments, Strangers started questioning Natalie's version. Comments like "weird that she wouldn't want her mother at the wedding" or "there are always two sides to a story" began to pop up. And then someone asked directly, was she invited or not? Eleanor didn't respond. But people who knew the truth started answering for her. An old friend, aware of the financial investment, wrote strange sabotage with $30,000 already spent on the party. Slowly, Natalie's narrative began slipping from her control. Because the truth, when silenced for too long, always finds a way to rise. And Eleanor's silence, which once looked like weakness, now sounded like maturity. She wasn't there to make a scene. She was simply refusing to feed a lie. Natalie tried deleting some comments. But the internet remembers. Screenshots spread quickly. A distant cousin posted stories revealing that Eleanor had paid for almost everything until she was excluded by email. The phrase "watch it on a screen," LOL, turned into a meme in family groups. The shame that had once been only Eleanor's now spread to others. And Natalie, cornered, began losing control of her own story. The attempt at public manipulation was backfiring. Eleanor didn't celebrate. On the contrary, she watched it all with sadness. She didn't want her daughter humiliated, she only wanted the truth recognized. But the exposure revealed something important: she wasn't alone. People were watching. People who had seen the devaluation, the exclusion, the manipulation. People who had stayed silent out of fear, but who were now beginning to speak. And in that, Eleanor found a strange comfort. Her silence hadn't been in vain. The most surprising moment came when a woman she didn't know sent her a private message. "Your story is mine. Thank you for not staying quiet." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears as she read it. Not out of vanity, but out of recognition. She realized her pain wasn't isolated. Thousands of mothers were living the same emotional injustice. And by taking a stand, maybe she was opening space for others to break free too. Natalie deleted the post 2 days later. No explanation. No apology. Just silence. But now, silence carried a different weight. Shame. Consequences. Eleanor no longer needed to scream. The truth was doing the work for her. At that point, she didn't want to fight anymore. She only wanted peace. Because she finally understood that dignity is quiet but profoundly powerful. What was meant to be another humiliation had become a turning point. Because the truth, even delayed, always finds its way. And Eleanor finally began to see she hadn't lost everything. She had only lost what no longer respected her. As the scandal spread, the phone calls began. First it was her ex-husband man who had disappeared when the children needed him most, now returning as the great peacemaker. "Eleanor, why are you doing this to Natalie?" he asked, as if he had any moral authority to question her. Eleanor listened in silence. When he finished, she answered with a dry line. "Doing what? Defending myself from exclusion?" He stuttered, tried to soften it. "The situation is out of control. Be the adult. Be the mother." She hung up. Because she had already been the adult for a lifetime. And now, she wanted only to be respected. Then came her ex-mother-in-law. A woman who had also contributed to Eleanor's devaluation in the past, quick to criticize, never to support. "You're really going to let your daughter get married alone? What kind of mother does that?" The words dripped like poison, but Eleanor didn't swallow them. The kind of mother who wasn't invited. The kind who was told, "Watch it on a screen." The silence on the other end was revealing. Because deep down, everyone knew what was happening. They just didn't want to face it. It was easier to pressure Eleanor to back down than to force Natalie to take responsibility for her choices. Relatives began dividing. Aunts and cousins sent messages urging reconciliation, but always laced with guilt. "Now isn't the time for pride, don't turn this into a war." But no one, absolutely no one, talked about the email. About the contempt. About the manipulation. Eleanor realized that social pressure would always fall on her. Because it was easier to demand from the mother who had always yielded than to confront the daughter who was now exposing her own toxicity. And as infuriating as it was also liberating. Because it revealed who truly saw and who only demanded. Some close friends, however, were blunt. If it were me, I wouldn't have the courage to go to that wedding after this. And those words helped Eleanor keep her feet grounded. Because it wasn't about pride. It was about coherence. Going back now would be self-betrayal. It would confirm everything people assumed, that mothers must accept anything, that unconditional love is just another word for emotional slavery. And Eleanor knew if she yielded again, she would lose the one thing she had fought so hard to gain, her autonomy. Even so, there were moments of doubt. At night, lying in bed alone, she thought, am I being too harsh? But then she remembered the coldness of that email. Her daughter treating her as an obstacle. A lifetime of sacrifice erased. And the answer returned, clear as ever, no. I'm being fair to myself. Because forgiveness without recognition doesn't heal. It only restarts the cycle. And Eleanor was not willing to relive it all. She already knew that script, and she was done being the character who suffers in silence. What struck her most was how people seemed more concerned about the wedding party than about the relationship between mother and daughter. As if the event mattered more than a woman's dignity. As if the celebration symbolized success even if built on exclusion. That pressure exposed an uncomfortable truth: appearances still weigh more than essence. But not for her. Not anymore. Eleanor had decided that even if people pointed fingers, she would be faithful to herself. With time, the external pressure eased. Some understood. Others distanced themselves. And Eleanor, instead of feeling sadness, felt relief. Because now she was surrounded only by those who respected her boundaries. The external storm only strengthened her internal certainty she was on the right path. And yes, it hurt. But the peace that followed was priceless. The peace of no longer having to bow to maintain broken relationships. And so, amid all the pressure, Eleanor stood firm. With steadiness. With serenity. Because it wasn't about pride, it was about emotional survival. And when a woman discovers she can live outside the role of martyr, there is no going back. It was a hot afternoon when Natalie showed up. No warning. No ceremony. Eleanor was watering her plants when she heard the insistent knock at the door. When she opened it, she saw her daughter, eyes swollen, face worn. We need to talk, Natalie said, walking in without waiting for permission. Eleanor closed the door slowly. Her heart was racing, but her face was calm. They sat at the table, the same one where countless childhood meals had taken place. But now, there was a canyon between them. A canyon of unspoken words, open wounds, choices that had cut deeper than they ever should have. Natalie began in a tone half plea, half accusation. I didn't think you'd take it so seriously. It was just a bad phase, Mom. Eleanor stayed silent. That attempt to minimize only showed how much Natalie still didn't understand. You erased me from your wedding, Natalie. You erased me from your life. That's not a bad phase. That's abandonment. Her daughter lowered her eyes. For the first time, she seemed without an answer. Then she reached for the most predictable card. But you're my mother, shouldn't you love me unconditionally? That question lit something inside Eleanor. A calm, mature indignation. Unconditional love doesn't mean humiliating myself for you. It doesn't mean financing my own rejection. Yes, I love you. But I've also learned to love myself. Natalie cried. She sobbed through broken phrases, trying to rebuild the bond with emotional arguments. I was confused, pressured. Marcel's mother is controlling. I didn't know how to handle it. Eleanor listened. But she didn't bend. Because listening to excuses without responsibility would mean repeating a pattern she had sworn never to repeat. You knew exactly what you were doing, she said firmly. You chose to erase me to fit into another family's narrative. And now that everything has collapsed, you want the embrace you rejected. Natalie cried harder. Begged for help. I need you, Mom. Please. Eleanor gently held her daughter's hand and answered, without hatred, without irony, only with truth. I needed you too. And you closed the door on me. Now it's my turn to keep the door only halfway open. Not for revenge. For protection. The silence between them was long. Heavy. But necessary. For the first time, Natalie wasn't facing the same old mother, the one who rushed at the first sign of pain. She was facing a new woman. Whole. A woman who still loved, but who now knew how to protect herself. Do you think I'm cruel, Natalie? Eleanor asked. Her daughter shook her head, crying. No, I just never knew you were this strong. And in that moment, for the first time, Eleanor felt truly seen. Not as a martyr, but as a woman. As a human being. The confrontation didn't end with a hug, nor with reconciliation, but with something rarer: understanding. The beginning of truth. Natalie asked for time. Eleanor gave it. But she made one thing clear. If we rebuild this, it will be on respect. I won't go back to that old dynamic. Her daughter nodded. And before leaving, she said something that would echo for years. You just gave me the biggest gift. A boundary. Eleanor closed the door with tears in her eyes. But not of sadness, of relief. For the first time, her pain had a name, a voice, a space. She didn't know if Natalie would change. But she knew that from now on, she would never again be the woman who accepted everything. And that alone was already a victory. In the days following the confrontation, Eleanor felt a strange calm. Not quite peace, but a kind of inner silence that follows a storm. Her daughter didn't call again. Made no new appeals. And unlike before, Eleanor didn't wait. Because now she knew the real reunion doesn't happen when the other comes back, it happens when you stop abandoning yourself. And this reunion with herself was the most important one yet. For the first time, she felt in control of her own story. When the official wedding invitation arrived a week late, with her name printed coldly, impersonally, Eleanor simply smiled. It wasn't about the event anymore. It was about what it symbolized. That expensive paper, full of decoration, represented nothing but an empty gesturia, disguised attempt to repair an image. No affection. No recognition. Just an effort to patch appearances. And she was no longer willing to pose as the happy mother in photos that erased everything that had happened. It was time to accept with serenity that not every family story ends in embraces. Eleanor didn't respond to the invitation. Nor did she throw it away. She kept it as a reminder of the moment she chose herself. Because the deepest rupture doesn't happen in shouting, it happens in the steady silence of someone who no longer yields. The wedding happened without her. Without her presence. Without her support. And for many, that was shocking. How could the bride's mother not show up? The answer was between the lines. Eleanor didn't go because she finally understood that being present at everything isn't proof of love. Often, it's proof of disrespect for yourself. Natalie didn't send photos. Didn't send thanks. Just silence after the event. But Eleanor wasn't shaken. For the first time, she wasn't emotionally hostage to her daughter's actions. She didn't feel guilt. She felt strength. Because she understood love cannot be used as chains. And being a mother doesn't mean accepting everything. The definitive rupture wasn't just with Natalie. It was with the woman Eleanor used to be: submissive, sacrificial, silent. That woman was gone, left behind with the checks never sent and the tears swallowed. One Sunday, while cleaning the house, Eleanor found an old photo herself, Natalie as a child, and Justin still little. The three smiling, full of future. She cried. But not from pain, from grief. For the woman she had been. For the innocence. For the hope that love would be enough. Because now she knew love without boundaries becomes prison. And what others called selfishness, for her was finally an act of emotional justice. You cannot rebuild a story with people who insist on erasing you from it. A friend asked her, "Don't you miss her?" Eleanor answered honestly, "I miss what I imagined we would be. not what we were. And that was liberating. Because it meant she could accept the loss without denying the affection. Without pretending it didn't hurt. But also without wanting to return. The rupture was final not because she stopped loving, but because she now loved differently. With clarity. With self-respect. With courage. Justin stayed silent. And Eleanor didn't reach out. Because part of her transformation was to stop chasing those who didn't see her. There was no more space to justify disrespect with blood ties. Now, connection had to be built not imposed. And if it didn't come, that was okay. Because she had finally built something greater, a bond with herself. Yes, the rupture hurt. But it also created space for something new. Something more real. Something she had never allowed herself to live before, an existence without guilt, without fear, and without depending on her children's approval. After years of living only for others, Eleanor woke up one Monday with no obligations imposed on her. No calls demanding help, no emails begging for transfers, no expectations about where she had to be. The house was silent, but it was a different silence. Not lonely, liberating. She made coffee slowly, chose her favorite mug, and sat on the porch without hurry. That morning tasted like rebirth. As if finally, after so many ruptures, she could breathe as a woman and not only as a mother. That's when she decided to open an email from a travel agency that had been sitting in her inbox for months. Italy. Florence. Rome. Tuscany. A trip she had always dreamed of but never dared to consider. There was always something more urgent: the children's school, renovations at her son's house, her ex-mother-in-law's surgery. But now, for the first time, she thought, what if the urgent thing is me? She bought the tickets. Without telling anyone. Because it wasn't to prove anything. It was for herself. A trip without guilt. Without anyone else's script. An intimate act of freedom. That simple decision became the symbol of a new life. Eleanor began filling her days with things she had always postponed. She went back to walking in the park with headphones, listening to old songs. She returned to writing in a blue-covered notebook, scribbling memories, reflections, even short stories. From the outside, none of it seemed extraordinary. But inside, each gesture was revolutionary. Because every step represented something bigger: the reconstruction of her own identity, outside the roles imposed on her. During that time, she also accepted, almost without thinking, an invitation from Robert. An old friend, widowed for years, who had always cared for her. They shared a glass of wine on a cool night, laughed about old memories, exchanged genuine glances. Eleanor wasn't thinking of romance, but she also wasn't close to it. For the first time, her heart beat for something light. Without demands. Without expectations. Just for the chance to feel again. And that, in itself, was already courage. What fascinated her most was how, as she reconnected with herself, the weight of family exclusion started to fade. Of course, it still hurt. But less. Because now there was space for new joys. And realizing that was transformative. The wound didn't disappear, but it stopped controlling her steps. She could feel pain, but also pleasure, joy, desire. And that was freedom. Because for years, she had believed. Because for years, she had believed her only purpose was to give. Now, she was discovering she also had the right to receive. To fill herself up. One day, while walking alone through a bookstore, Eleanor stumbled upon a book titled, "You Don't Need to Justify Yourself to Be Happy." She smiled. She bought it immediately. Not because she needed the phrase, but because, at last, it made sense. What once would have sounded like selfishness now felt like wisdom. And that changed everything. She started noticing small signs from the universe affirming this new chapter: people crossing her path, doors opening, unexpected invitations. Life itself seemed to whisper now, "You are truly alive." Her liberation wasn't one big event. It was a process. Built through small, daily choices. Choosing not to answer provocations. Choosing to take care of her body. Choosing silence over endless explanations. Choosing lightness. And, most of all choosing herself. Eleanor no longer needed to scream to be heard. She was heard within herself. And that was stronger than any external approval. Because now she knew it isn't being accepted by others that gives us value. It's accepting ourselves fully, with our history, our scars, and our limits. Every day of this new phase felt like a quiet celebration. A toast to the woman emerging from the shadows. And she didn't know what the future would bring, but she knew one thing for certain: whatever came, she would never go back to who she had been. The erased woman. The used woman. The sacrificed woman. That version was gone. The one walking forward now was whole. The call came without warning. It was Justin, on the other end of the line, his voice trembling. "Mom, I was wrong. And I owe you an apology." Eleanor stayed silent for a few seconds. Hearing her son finally acknowledge her pain felt like opening a window after years in the dark. He explained that he had been reflecting, talking with relatives, and had even started therapy. "You were always the foundation, and we never saw it. It wasn't redemption, but it was a beginning." And for the first time, Eleanor felt recognized. Not as the mother who endured everything, but as the woman who had survived. Days later, Justin came over with his daughter, little Mia. They spent a simple afternoon together, an old movie, a homemade cake, soft laughter. Eleanor sat on the floor playing with the child and realized this was a new way of being a mother. Without guilt. Without pressure. Just presence. Natalie still hadn't reached out. But Eleanor no longer lived in waiting. If her daughter came back, it would have to be with truth. Because now she knew love without respect is prison. And she would never return to that emotional cell again. One quiet evening, as she wrote in her blue notebook, Eleanor penned these words. "I didn't lose my children. I lost the version of myself who accepted everything in the name of love." That was it. It wasn't about vengeance. It wasn't about pride. It was about emotional justice. And about never again forgetting herself. How many women do you know who were swallowed whole by the role of mother and forgotten as a person? Who spent decades believing that love meant sacrifice, that silence was proof of maturity, and that respect could only be earned through submission? Eleanor's story may seem extreme, but quietly, it represents millions. Women who gave everything they had: time, money, energy, mental health, and were still called selfish when they dared to say no. Who were accused of not loving enough simply for demanding the bare minimum dignity. For years, Eleanor confused love with obligation. Confused presence with blind acceptance. Until one day, she realized she was financing her own exclusion. And when she chose to break the cycle, she was treated as a threat. But she endured. She stood firm. And slowly, she began to rediscover herself. This story doesn't have a fairy tale ending. It has something better: clarity. Eleanor didn't get her children back as they once were. She got herself back. And in doing so, she opened the door for new, honest relationships built on respect, not control. Her transformation didn't come with a pretty speech. It came with silence. With boundaries. With the first no spoken with true conviction. Because when a woman stops accepting crumbs in the name of love, the world around her begins to shift. Does it hurt? Yes. But is it worth it? Absolutely. If you felt that this story could be yours or someone you love, don't ignore the call. This journey doesn't end here. It begins now inside of you. Because it isn't just about Eleanor. It's about all of us. And if you believe more people need to hear stories like this, raw, real, transformative, subscribe now. This channel isn't just entertainment. It's a place where truths find a voice, where wounds turn into strength, and where you never have to feel alone again. Click subscribe, hit the bell, and leave a comment: I choose myself. Because only those brave enough to choose themselves truly begin to live.